Hello everybody and welcome to these talks on nutrition and recovery from COVID-19. What we eat and drink is a really important part of recovery from disease, but it's often overlooked because it's such a routine part of our everyday lives. But that is why it's so crucial. What we put in our bodies is an incredibly important part of recovery. I'm Mary Hickson and I'm Professor of Dietetics at the University of Plymouth. I'm working with colleagues from across the UK, and together we've brought you these talks to help you answer any questions you have about diet and the recovery from COVID-19. We have some great speakers who are real experts in their field. It's worth mentioning here, diet and nutrition are really difficult to study. If you change one nutrient, you change the whole diet. And also individual responses to dietary change are really variable. And this makes it hard for experts to give you hard and fast definitive advice. We don't have all the answers, and particularly so with this new disease. But we do want to share with you the best available evidence and practical advice. When you've finished watching any of the talks, there will be an option for you to ask questions. Use the Q&A function to post your questions. And at the end of June, we're hoping to post a final presentation where we will get all the speakers to answer the questions you have. We're really interested to know what you think about these talks. So please use the feedback option and give us your rating. Our great desire is to help people to recover well from COVID-19 and give them up-to-date advice on nutrition and diet. We really hope you find this a valuable and useful resource.
Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about the interaction between diet, immunity and inflammation. We're going to look at three big questions. Can what you eat or drink affect your immune system? Can what you eat or drink help to control inflammation? And is there an ideal diet for supporting immunity and controlling inflammation? These are the things I'm going to cover. I'm going to start out by addressing what is the immune system, because I think it's important to understand the immune system and immunity if we're going to think about diet in the context of immunity. Then I'm going to talk about how diet is involved in supporting immunity and whether there are any specific nutrients that might be important. Then I'll move on to talk about inflammation and address this question of whether inflammation is good or bad. Then I'm going to try to address the question of whether diet can affect inflammation. And again, are there specific nutrients? I'll then ask the question whether the gut microbiota is involved and how it's involved. And then finally, really cut to the chase. Is there an immune supporting diet? Is there an anti-inflammatory diet? So let's start now. We're surrounded by bacteria, viruses, and so on. Many of these are harmless, but some of them are harmful. So we're continuously exposed to microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, etc. Harmful microorganisms, so harmful bacteria, harmful viruses, can make us sick. These harmful microorganisms are called pathogens. But note, not all bacteria and viruses are harmful. Most are actually harmless and some are even helpful. Nevertheless, we do have the harmful ones in our environment, the pathogens. And our immune system is the way we protect ourselves against pathogens. That is, against dangerous bacteria, dangerous viruses, and also other things, dangerous fungi, dangerous parasitic worms, and so on. So how does the immune system work? It must be pretty complex to deal with this array of organisms. So there are some different functional features of the immune system that I want to talk about. Firstly, the immune system acts as a barrier to prevent entry of pathogens. So you could think of the skin, the lining of your gut, of your respiratory tract, and of the genitourinary tract. These are barriers that keep pathogens out. Then you have the acid pH of the stomach. This can kill some bacteria. and therefore that helps keep them away. There are antibacterial proteins in saliva, in tears, and so on. And there are even friendly bacteria, for example, on the skin and in the gut, that help keep the harmful bacteria out. So this barrier function is really important. Then, if the invaders, the pathogens, actually do get through this barrier, they can be recognized and tracked. And the immune system is the way we recognize them. So first of all, we have proteins in the bloodstream and in secretions. So these proteins are called complement proteins, antibodies. These recognize invaders and they coat them. And this coating enables them to be identified by cells of the immune system. So the recognition of pathogens is really key. Then once trapped, invaders are destroyed by the immune system. So we have specialist cells that are part of our immune system that actually destroy these harmful invaders. Some of these cells engulf bacteria and digest them. Other cells bombard bacteria or virally infected cells with toxic chemicals. So this destructive element of the immune system is quite interesting and obviously very important in controlling infections. Finally, and really interestingly, the immune system has a memory component. So all of your immunological encounters over the years are remembered by your immune system. You actually retain what are called memory cells. These memory cells remember what they've dealt with before. And what this means is if you're reinfected, you have a faster and more vigorous immune response. So your immune response is more effective the second time round. Now the memory response is the basis of vaccination, which of course is very topical right now. So with a vaccination, you introduce something that's a little bit like the pathogen. You train your immune system to respond to this so that if you really encounter the pathogen, the immune system is all ready to go. It's sort of on a high level of alert, if you like, to respond very quickly. And we know, of course, that vaccines are very important in helping our immune system along. So just to summarize, the immune system has these four functional layers. Firstly, it acts as an exclusion barrier, trying to keep out things that don't belong. Secondly, it can recognize or identify things that don't belong if they break through the barrier. Thirdly, it eliminates or kills the things that don't belong. And finally, it can remember the encounters that it's had with things that don't belong. So the immune system is pretty sophisticated, it's pretty complicated. And all of these different functional capabilities come about because there are many different cell types that go to make up the immune system. So you might be familiar with the term white blood cells. Now, in fact, there are many different types of white blood cells, and they're shown on the right-hand side of this slide here. So we have cells like B lymphocytes or B cells. They produce antibodies. We have T lymphocytes or T cells. They're sort of orchestrators of the immune response. Some cells, like these ones down here, the monocytes, the dendritic cells, the macrophages, and the neutrophils, these are cells that actually engulf entire bacteria and digest them. Natural killer cells, they kill virally infected cells. They kill tumor cells. So we see a sort of division of labor here, where we have all of these different types of cells, each with their own functional capability, but they have to work together in a controlled and integrated way if we're going to have good immune defense. So this is a little bit like the instruments in an orchestra, all playing their own music, but together they make a wonderful sound. Individually, they can't play the whole symphony, but they can contribute to the symphony by doing their bit and working with the other instruments. So that's how the immune system's working in this controlled, integrated way. So what we see is all of these immune cells are seeking out and destroying the bacteria, the virally infected cells, and so on. I mentioned white blood cells and the fact that these cells circulate in the bloodstream, but in fact the immune system is spread in tissues throughout the body as well as the cells circulating in the bloodstream. So for example, you have immune cells in the spleen, in the lymph nodes, in your tonsils, along the gut wall, which I'll mention later on, and so on. So the cells are actually circulating in the bloodstream, but they come together in these so-called lymphoid organs like the spleen and the lymph nodes, and that's where they actually communicate with one another and make immunological decisions. So that is a pretty complicated system. How is diet involved in supporting immunity? Because it turns out that diet is actually really important in terms of determining people's ability to respond well to pathogens. So again, there are some sort of features of nutrition and immunity that I just want to go through. So firstly, the immune response involves significant, I've called it construction. This is what we call biosynthesis. It's actually making things, making new proteins like antibodies, making entire new cells. So your immune system replicates itself many times over when it's challenged. So we have to make new cells, we make new proteins, all sorts of things. So of course, to make things, you need building blocks. And the building blocks of all of this are the proteins that we eat, the fats we eat, and so on. So obviously the diet is the source of the building blocks of the immune system. Secondly, the immune system needs a lot of energy. It's very metabolically active. And just like your muscles need energy when you're exercising, your immune system needs energy when it's dealing with pathogens. So it needs energy sources, glucose, fats, and amino acids. These are energy sources. But also, to use these energy sources, we need what I've called here metabolic machinery. This is enzymes that convert one thing into another. And those enzymes often need cofactors. And those cofactors are usually different vitamins or minerals. So we need the vitamins and minerals to support the metabolic activity of the immune system as it goes about its business. Thirdly, this construction, the biosynthesis, and the energy generation or metabolism need to be tightly controlled and regulated so that the right thing is happening at the right time in the right place. And it turns out that many vitamins and minerals are really important in this control, in this regulation of how the immune system is working. So things like vitamin A, vitamin D, and zinc are all regulators of what's going on when the immune system is responding. So immediately you can see there's going to be a whole lot of different nutrients that are really important in terms of supporting the immune response. And people have been studying these nutrients for decades now, working out which ones are important, what their mechanisms are, how they actually work to help immunity. And here I'm just summarizing all of that work by pointing out that vitamins A, D, and E and the related colored compounds called carotenoids, these orange colored chemicals that make some fruits and vegetables orange and indeed pink flamingos pink. These carotenoids are also very important in the immune system, but the fat-soluble vitamins undoubtedly are super important, A, D, and E, and maybe vitamin K as well. The water-soluble vitamins, B6, B9, that's another name for folate, B12 and C, they're all important. Minerals, I've mentioned some of these already, zinc, copper, selenium, and iron, but there are others like magnesium, manganese. These are really important in the immune system. I've already mentioned amino acids. Many amino acids are vital to the immune system. Essential amino acids, sulfur-containing amino acids, and also fatty acids. Essential fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids. So there's a whole mix of nutrients that are important to support the immune system to function. And we know that people who are deficient in any of these nutrients have impaired or weakened immunity, and that makes them more susceptible to infection. Now, of course, we don't eat nutrients, we eat foods. And the nutrients I've been talking about, of course, are found in all sorts of foods. Now, one of the types of foods that's very rich in lots of the vitamins, the minerals, and so on, are fruits and vegetables. So this is just to tell you that some researchers did a study, a randomized controlled trial in older people. These were older people who didn't usually eat very much fruit and veg. They ate less than 2 portions a day. Of course, the government says we should eat at least 5 portions a day. And they were put into this study, and half of them carried on their usual diet, which is low in fruit and veg, and the other half were put onto a diet where they, for the study, ate 5 or more portions of fruit and veg a day. So this is comparing low and high fruit and veg intake. And then after a period of weeks, they were given a vaccination. This is actually a vaccination to pneumococcus, and the response to vaccination was measured. And you can do that by measuring antibodies in the blood of people, the antibodies that are formed as a result of exposure to the vaccine. So the higher these antibody levels, the better the vaccine has worked. And it turned out that in these older people eating more vegetables, the vaccination response was stronger than in the old people eating low amounts of fruit and veg. And that's probably because the fruit and veg are delivering all of these immune supporting nutrients, of course. So what about inflammation? So it's clear diet's pretty important for supporting the immune system. What about inflammation? What's inflammation? Now maybe you're thinking, oh, inflammation, that's all about aches and pains. And of course you're right about that, because inflammation causes aches, it causes pains, and so on. Now, it turns out inflammation is actually part of immunity, and inflammation is designed to make things tough for pathogens. But it turns out inflammation can also make things tough for ourselves. But in essence, inflammation is meant to be helpful, and when it works properly, it is helpful. But when inflammation happens when it shouldn't be happening, or if it's not controlled properly, inflammation can be harmful. And in fact, there are diseases that are called inflammatory diseases, and we treat those diseases with anti-inflammatory drugs. So arthritis would be an example, where here we've got inflammation destroying the joints of this person. Inflammatory bowel diseases, where we've got inflammation in the gut wall, ultimately destroying the gut wall. So these are obvious examples where inflammation has gone wrong and it's causing big problems for the individual. Now it turns out that inflammation actually is much more widespread than people thought maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And it turns out inflammation is actually pretty important underlying heart disease. Inflammation underlies some types of cancer. Inflammation underlies Alzheimer's disease. So inflammation is really important, not just in these diseases where there's obvious sort of clear inflammation and we treat with anti-inflammatory drugs to try to help the patient. Inflammation can also be silent but also harmful. So putting all this together, we need a good balance, I think, between immunity and inflammation. We want good defense against bacteria and viruses, and we want inflammation to be controlled so that it's not damaging our own tissues. So again, thinking about what nutrients in foods can influence inflammation. And here I've produced two lists: things that are likely to increase inflammation and things that are likely to decrease inflammation. And again, this is based on experiments that people have done over many years. Let's start on the right-hand side and think about foods that can decrease inflammation. So again, vitamin C and D are very important here. Many minerals, zinc, selenium, and copper, are anti-inflammatory. They help to control inflammation. Again, some amino acids are important. Omega-3 fatty acids. These are very active anti-inflammatory nutrients, helping to control inflammation. And then there are these plant phenolics. These are chemicals found in plants. They're the chemicals that give fruits, vegetables, berries, and so on their colors. Turns out these are also quite important in controlling inflammation. So again, these vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, and so on, these are nutrients, but they come from food. So what sort of foods might we be thinking about to help us control inflammation? So whole grains, again, vegetables and fruits, berries, seeds, nuts, fish, which of course are a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, and so on. Olive oil, which is a good source of polyphenolic compounds. So there are foods that people might want to consume that help reduce the likelihood of inflammation behaving in a harmful way. Now let's look on the left-hand side. The list seems a bit shorter here, but these are things which are very active and which are often consumed in high amounts. So simple sugars probably act to increase inflammation. Saturated fats seem to be able to increase inflammation. Oxidized foods, so foods that have been burnt, that have been deep fried, these contain modified food components that can trigger inflammation. So again, if we think about the simple sugars and the saturated fats, I think we're talking about sweet foods, highly sweetened drinks, fatty foods, some processed foods, maybe some ready meals, although not all, might be sources of nutrients that are actually not good for our inflammatory state. So again, just thinking about this balance I mentioned before, we need a good balance of immunity to protect ourselves, and with inflammation, which can be damaging or harmful if it's kicking off in a way that it shouldn't. And I've mentioned a number of nutrients that have roles in supporting immunity and in controlling inflammation. So what I'm trying to show here is that vitamin A, the B vitamins, vitamin C, D, and E, minerals like zinc, copper, iron, selenium, some other minerals, some amino acids, omega-3s, these all help to support the immune response. So they weigh this side down, resetting the balance. I've also mentioned that vitamin C and E, zinc, copper, selenium, some amino acids, omega-3s, and the plant phenolic compounds help us control inflammation. So they lighten the load on this side, helping to set the balance as we need it to be. Again, thinking about the foods that these nutrients come from. So here I've listed the nutrients I've been talking about, and here good dietary sources. And of course you see quite a mix of things here. You see lots of plant foods, so lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, seeds, nuts, and so on. So I think people pretty much recognize that fruits and veg, berries, what have you, these are all more healthful foods, and that's because they deliver these healthy nutrients. But of course there are some nutrients that animal type foods are good sources of, and in fact that plants are not really very good sources of. So vitamin B12, for example, is, animal foods are good sources of B12, and plant foods in general are not such good sources. The long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, what we call EPA and DHA, oily fish is really the only really rich source of these nutrients. So what I'm getting at here is really, a diverse, well-balanced diet with plenty of plant foods and some animal-based foods will give you the nutrients that your immune system needs to function well, and those same nutrients will help you control inflammation. Excuse me. So what I'm talking about really is a diet with plenty of fruits, veg, berries, nuts, seeds, and pulses, but some animal foods. Oily fish in particular I think are important. So, it's the sort of pictures you might see here. And of course, excuse me, they look a little bit like the Mediterranean diet. So this is the Mediterranean diet pyramid, where the foods that should be encouraged are at the bottom here, at the wide end of the pyramid, and the foods that should be eaten less often are at the top, narrow end of the pyramid. So at the bottom here we have vegetables, we have fruits, we have grains, legumes, seeds and nuts, we have seafood, and then towards the top we have the animal-based foods, and we're right at the top we have the more fatty foods and the sweeter foods. So I think this Mediterranean diet pyramid is very much mirroring what I was saying about the sort of diet that will give you the nutrients to support your immune system, and the sort of diet that will help you control inflammation. So I think there's nothing sort of magic here. This is a sort of a healthy diet which is well recognized and well promoted. And in fact, there are research studies showing that individuals with a stronger adherence to a Mediterranean style diet have lower levels of inflammation that are usually measured by taking blood samples and measuring inflammatory chemicals in the blood. So in other words, there's research showing that the more like the Mediterranean diet that's consumed, the lower the level of inflammation in the body. Now, the last thing to touch on is the gut microbiota. So you have bacteria living in your gut. Most of these are very harmless or even helpful organisms. Of course, if you have harmful organisms living in your gut, that's not very good, and the body acts to try to get rid of those harmful organisms. But this term microbiota is used to describe the collective of organisms that are living in the gut. So here's a scheme trying to show that there's a communication between the organisms living in the gut and the immune system in a person. So we have across the middle here, this layer, this is actually the gut wall. So the gut wall is one cell thick, and these cells snuggle up really closely together. And in fact, these places where cells meet with one another are called tight junctions. And it's very important that we have these tight junctions, because that stops all the stuff that's out in the gut from actually making its way into the body. Because remember, I said the wall is only one cell thick. So on the gut side of the gut wall, we have all of the bacteria that are living out here. Now, of course, these bacteria are alive, they're metabolizing, they're communicating with one another, they're producing chemicals. Some of the chemicals they produce are called short-chain fatty acids, and it turns out these short-chain fatty acids are very important to us. These short-chain fatty acids nourish our gut wall, and they actually also nourish our immune system. So in other words, you have bacteria in your gut that are producing chemicals that are very helpful to the integrity of your gut wall, that are very helpful to your immune system. So this is a sort of symbiotic relationship between you and your gut bacteria. Of course, if the gut bacteria is upset, this is called dysbiosis, that symbiotic relationship is broken down somehow, and things are not right. So you might actually even develop a condition that could be a short-term condition, but it could be a long-term condition. So having the right gut microbiota turns out to be quite important. So I've mentioned chemicals are produced by the gut bacteria, and these chemicals are used by the gut wall and by the immune system. So that's the communication in one direction. But it turns out the immune system is also communicating back to the gut bacteria. And this is indicated in this part of the slide here. And what we see here is immune cells actually squeezing, making themselves really skinny and squeezing through a tight junction, so that part of the immune cell remains within the body and part has actually gone out into the gut. And what we think is going on here is the immune system is actually sampling what's out in the gut, and it's making immunological decisions based on that sampling. This cell will squeeze back into the body later on, and it will go off. This is a lymph node, which I mentioned before. It will go off to a lymph node and communicate with other immune cells, and immunological decisions will be made. So this is a two-way interaction. It's a bi-directional relationship. The microbiota are communicating with the immune system, and the immune system is communicating with the microbiota. And we think a healthy gut microbiota helps to support the immune system and to control inflammation. So which nutrients and foods are good for supporting a healthy gut microbiota? So again, I list nutrients on the left, foods on the right. So nutrients, so fiber is really good for the gut microbiota, because we don't use that fiber ourselves. It passes all the way down the gut, and there are bacteria down in the gut that thrive on fiber. That gives them their energy. They produce the short-chain fatty acids that nourish our gut wall and so on. Again, the plant polyphenolic compounds, these colorful chemicals from plants, seem to be important for the gut microbiota. The microbiota needs some vitamins from us, needs minerals from our diet, also needs amino acids, and even omega-3 fatty acids seem to be used by some of the bacteria down there. So again, when we think about foods, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, pulses, legumes and so on, berries, for the polyphenols, seeds and nuts, fish for the omega-3s, but also fermented foods, because fermented foods contain some live bacteria already. And it turns out those bacteria can pass right through our stomach, our small intestine, right down to our large intestine, and can actually take hold there and grow. And you know, those things seem to be good for us. Then we have two other alternatives. Prebiotics are nutrients which we don't use but which feed the bacteria, and then probiotics are actually live bacteria that we might consume, for example, in a yogurt drink or indeed in a fermented food, and those probiotic organisms get all the way down to our large intestine and colonize there. And there are some probiotic organisms that seem to be quite helpful to us. So again, the sort of diet I talked about for supporting the immune system, the sort of diet I talked about for controlling inflammation, is actually exactly the same diet that will create a healthy gut microbiota. And of course, that's no accident. It makes a lot of sense that a diet that produces a healthy microbiota is the same as the diet that produces a healthy immune system. So I think you know the answers now. Is there an immune supporting diet? Is there an anti-inflammatory diet? I think an immune supporting diet and an anti-inflammatory diet are exactly the same thing. And it's this diverse, varied diet with plenty of plant-based foods and some animal-based foods to provide the nutrients that are not high in plant-based foods. So something a bit like the Mediterranean diet, if you like. Thanks very much for your attention.